Herewith, I'm going to give you a sense of our plan for today. I'm hoping in the first third or so to talk generally about what field we have in front of us, time-based media art, and to think about it with certain terms and concepts, setting it inside some of the course goals. We'll go back a little farther and consider more about how time-based media art, video art, etc., sit inside a larger arc of conversation in aesthetics and in art practice. And we're also going to look ahead and give you a sense of the series and the incredible lineup of speakers, artists, and curators we have to offer throughout the semester. All right, so first of all, time-based media art. For some who are joining this gathering, this might be a fairly familiar term, a term with which many of you work, whether as curators or as artists yourselves. Also for many, some students and community members, this might be amongst the first times you've heard this hybrid phrase. So let's think a little bit more about what comes under this umbrella, as well as why it actually has often been construed as something that's fairly difficult to name, and interestingly so. So first, from the beginning, a beginning that's often associated in the mid-20th century or 60s and 70s of art practice, there have been a lot of debates about how to title this form. And in nearly every exhibition or scholarly treatise since, there's almost always an announcement about the difficulty of defining it. So that's part of the legacy of this practice. Video art is another category. Also, even as the video art defines itself, it sometimes defines itself within and against the feature film, but also defines itself within and against art world categories such as painting or sculpture, sometimes also live performance or the experience of television, music, etc. So this sort of slippery status has always been part of its ethos, and it spawned a number of other names. And so throughout the course and throughout the speaker series, we're going to hear an invocation of a range of terms. And you might even think video art, media art, time-based art, moving image art, video installation, expanded cinema, video performance. What slightly different associations come to mind when you think about these terms, and also what the allegiances are amongst these kinds of terms. Way back, let's say it's fairly way back, in 1975, the cross-disciplinary artist David Anton anticipated this terminological slipperiness. He noted that he used the word video art in his now classic essay, The Distinctive Features of the Medium, saying video art, the name is equivocal, a good name. It leaves open all questions and asks them anyway. Is this an art form, a new genre, an anthology of valued activity conducted in a particular arena defined by display on a cathode ray tube? The kind of video made by a special class of people, artists, whose works are exhibited primarily in what is called the art world. The artist video, okay? So this is him anticipating some of that, the contradictions and complexities, saying that's good. David Anton himself, who students have been assigned to read, was not only an artist, but also a teacher and administrator at one of the first and most early significant art programs in our UC system at UC San Diego. And he actually had a vested interest in trying to both understand the discursive landscape of this practice, but also to keep it nimble and active and variable, in part because he had a professional interest in making sure that it could be a landscape that welcomed new kinds of innovation. Since, of course, 1975, social and technological changes have only expanded the range of forms that might come under this umbrella. And of course, since 1975, we have new technologies for expression other than those associated with the cathode ray. Those that might welcome a whole range of other time-based media forms, whether we use the word art film or start to think about things that start to call themselves software art, internet art, digital art, AR, VR art. And you can see from my slides that we could continue to go off the screen with more ideas about how these forms start to develop. But I think it's important to remember that even now from our position in 2021, that all throughout, let's say, the last 50 years, different technologies have produced different capacities for the arts, that the arts in some ways have anticipated new technologies, and that at every turn, there is a changed nature about what art forms might possibly be, even as it's also, of course, changing our conceptions of self and society. So the history of time-based media art is always coinciding with, sometimes in a syncopated relationship with, the history of technology. So in coming to terms then, with the difficulty of coming to terms, I think we might also recall some of the other early champions and promoters of the field. For instance, Barbara London, assigned in reading today and who we're going to hear from later in the semester, one of the first curators of video art before it was even considered to be a curatable form. She talks also about the difficulty of defining the form right from the beginning. I'm sharing a pretty lengthy quote, and I'll ask you to analyze it a little bit with me. The critical discourse around video, she says, began with heated conversations among artists themselves, who, for the most part, had emerged from the visual arts. Critics would sometimes write, "Video has come of age," forgetting they had written the same thing a year before. Experimental film largely belonged to cinema studies, an academic discipline that deals with film. Expanded cinema became the term used to describe radical experimentation with the moving image, be it film, video, multimedia, performance, or even immersive environment. Expanded cinema practitioners rejected the conventional one-way relationship between audience and image, and most opposed commercial film's one-dimensionality. Many experimented with what they considered the physicality of time and space. So herewith, I'm just going to flag some of the ways that Barbara London starts to create a discursive landscape for understanding the form. We see her foregrounding the fact that, from her perspective at least, most of the artistic experimentation came from the visual arts. By that she means those who actually might well have been trained first and foremost in practices such as painting and sculpture, or perhaps photography. And as much as we then think of this form as a form that's associated with the screen, we want to foreground the fact that for many artists, the screen, the turn to the screen as a medium and material, was a particular move away from the medium and material of the canvas, of granite or stone, as well as the medium and material of theater or music or dance. London also here is distinguishing this particular world from the world of film, even experimental film, and she's definitely distinguishing it from what she calls the commercial film, the industry of the commercial film. And we might ask ourselves all the way along, what's going on when those distinctions are made? What is the special place of this form? And before leaving her quote, very important, I think, to also note that she is thinking at all times more fundamentally about how these artists that so intrigued her 50 years ago were fundamentally thinking about the physicality of time and space, and really considered the manipulation and defamiliarization and alternate presentation of time and space to be essential to their practice. I'll also note then, of course, too, that she decides to alight on one of the terms that I listed, expanded cinema, as the term that she felt was most relevant at the time. So we might ask ourselves, what's meant by that? What comes to mind when we think about that conjunction of expanded, that term expanded meeting cinema, okay? We might start to ask those questions by thinking about some artists, some of the premier artists that we're going to hear from later in the semester, including, for instance, somebody like Isaac Julian, the London-born, California-based, actually fellow UC professor, who is known and has often produced moving image work that might sit inside, comfortably inside, a cinematic theater with its rows and screens, but also somebody who is known for creating multi-screen, or what's often called multi-channel video installations, like those you see on the screen. So looking for Langston as a single channel work that might appear in a cinema. And those below, Playtime and Lessons of the Hour, currently on view or almost on view at McAvoy Foundation for the Arts, where we see ourselves in, we could at least say an expanded space for the display of the screen. We might think about others. Somebody like William Kentridge, who we'll hear from later in February. Kentridge, a South African-based artist, is actually someone who was trained first in theater and puppetry, somebody who thinks then about the manipulation and animation of the object world, and somebody for whom the act of drawing, often associated with the visual arts, is a primary resource for the screen-based work he ultimately produces. We'll hear more about how he does that and how he practices that, and we can think about the relation and the similarities among somebody like Julian and somebody like Kentridge, but also the slightly different origins and effects and techniques that they're deploying. Since we're going to hear from both of those artists later on in the semester, I'll let them speak for themselves later. And just to get ourselves thinking a little bit more and sensitize a bit more to what type of forms we're thinking about, I'll turn to an artist that we're not going to hear from personally, but who's also a pivotal figure in the field, Bill Viola. Once again, if I share images here, I'll show you, once again, you see him creating environments, multi-channel environments inside of a gallery space. Or in the second image, a single channel environment where I'll ask especially students for whom this is a newer form to imagine what it might be to go to a museum space or a gallery space and to enter a gallery where one is used to encountering paintings, and to imagine encountering a screen that is largely taking up the entire wall space, and where one is seated, not in the rows of a cinema, but on that museum bench, the classic museum bench. And one might be a single viewer. You might imagine that gallery somewhat more crowded, but think about what it is to receive a screen-based image in that kind of expanded space. And this last image is a still from one of his signature pieces, his great single channel work, The Raft, from 2004. And just to get ideas going, I'm going to ask my team member Paris to share her screen. We think her power to display is a little stronger. She's in my office on the UC campus right now. And I'm going to ask her to share this work. This is just a clip of a much longer work. And I want you to think, and I'm going to ask you to share aloud what you see and how it affects you. Thank you. Thank you, Paris. I hope that came across well. We sometimes worry about sharing high quality video art, hard to do it on Zoom sometimes. And this is a moment when I get to also see how things are going in the chat and Q&A. But from community members and students, whether this was a familiar work to you or less familiar work, what first of all struck you? What parts of that short clip do you remember or recall? What we'll do is, I think, as Casey said, you should feel free to share things online. But also, what we'd love to do is hear from anybody who might be willing to let us put their voice, activate their voice, so that you can share just some preliminary thoughts, no wrong answers, of what you see with the group. Mohammed, looks like you're ready to go. We'd love to hear from you.
Oh, is my mic on?
Gotcha, yeah.
Awesome. I was just gonna say that their like reactions were really delayed. It seemed like something that was super unexpected, and something that could affect them in a really maybe negative way, but no one really noticed it because they were so caught up in what they were doing, and so caught up in their own head, and so they only noticed it when it was too late, when they were already falling. So that's what I noticed.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Mohammed. And I mean, I'll say two things about that reaction right from the get-go. That one, that you could say that the slow motion nature perhaps allowed you to do that sort of analysis, to make you see whether people were anticipating or noticing, and that you were more able to make that judgment call that they weren't, that they were preoccupied, because of the pace, the slowed pace at which this came about. But also that you're creating a story, around this image, that you have sort of a sense of these people self-preoccupied in a certain way. You also have a sense that there is threat and risk and potential doom that lies ahead. And you put that frame, that sort of narrative frame, on what you saw. Thank you.
Thank you.
Others?
Yeah, I'd like to just share in the chat. I'm seeing, Christina Kramlich was saying first looked like a casting call with all the players dressed their part. Then they were all equalized.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I love that. Thank you, Christina. And it is also there, when we sort of see this assembly of people, it's a sort of then an extra question, an extra type of story that Christine is trying to imagine, that we're all trying to imagine, to put on this cluster of people. Are these people at a casting call? Are these people at a bus stop? What has brought them together? And they actually they don't necessarily seem to form a true community, right? Which is, I think, what's so great about the casting call. When you show up for a casting call, you're very much in your own space, and not so much interacting with others. So another spin, another frame, another story that we could put on the assembly. Thank you.
Yeah, and I have another comment from Eric Cortez.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Eric, are you able to say your comment aloud?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment on the sound, which I thought was curious because I thought I noticed two of the people talking, but I couldn't hear their voices. I could hear the sound of the water coming in very clearly though, and at the end, I think I might have heard a few of them like yell, but I wasn't sure. But I thought that was an interesting part of it because I know visually it was powerful, but sound-wise, I wonder what message that carries.
Yeah, right. And what would happen if we heard more clearly the yells or whatever it might be that might be reactions, so that when it comes to the sort of bodily reaction of taking cover, we might want to wonder if we would have a synced soundtrack that also had the vocalized reaction of get me away, save me. But that decision about how to deploy audio in the course of a time-based image is another thing that we're going to talk about all the time. That's something we talked about in our opening course on Tuesday, was about time-based media art that sometimes deploys sound that works in sync with the image, and sometimes in decided contrast with the image, sometimes to reinforce it, sometimes to abstract, or sometimes challenge or obscure it further. Thank you, Eric. All right,
We have a couple more folks with their hands raised.
Okay, cool. Can you let's pick an order for them, if you don't mind, Edgar?
Yeah, so Paige and then Michelle.
Okay, we'll do Paige and Michelle. Thank you. Paige?
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so what I found to be really interesting is when I was looking at the image in the video clip that was shown, I couldn't help but think how it's kind of a metaphor to describe how people live their lives, and the fact that, like, looking at it objectively, when everything's in the calm, people they're not aware of their surroundings. Everyone's focused on what they're doing and what's going on in their lives. And yeah, they know that there's people around them, but I mean, you could just see how individually focused all of the people were in that picture. And then once the chaos started to come down on them, that's when they noticed, like, oh God, like, there's people around me, like, how am I going to get out of this? And I feel like, yeah, it's kind of just a metaphor of human nature, I guess, was the takeaway that I found from that.
Yeah, human nature and societal formation,
Yeah.
you could say. And there's nothing like a disaster to form a society, right? Or to remind us that we might need to be, that we might need to see ourselves in community. It relates to Christina's comment about how they were all individual at one point and that the disaster equalized them. But it's that sort of sense of the sort of the new equality found amongst all of them that you had the sense was going to bond them again, bond them in by a sense of danger. And yeah, a metaphor for life. Thank you. Okay, last comment.
Oh, okay. Very similar to what was just discussed. I thought it was interesting to visually see how each person was dressed differently and their mannerisms and their relationship to other people. I saw one woman clutching her purse, and then as soon as the water came in upon them, they just became bodies reacting to the water.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so that in another way, they start to almost lose their demographic specificity.
Yes.
Yeah, right. And I love that. And let's remember this as we go a little later on. Bodies reacting to the water. That's another way of talking about Christina's point about the grand equalization, that at the end of the day, we're bodies reacting. Right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, wonderful, guys. That really helps me a lot. And I know it helps each other if we, to hear comments from everyone else. And you'll have to excuse me as I face the noon sun coming into my office. I'm going to keep on trying to adjust. All right, I'll go back now to sharing my screen and sharing PowerPoints, and let's think about some of these ideas and some of these reactions as we go. Sorry. Okay, so we thought about Viola, we thought about the raft in particular. I also now, actually very much in light of some of the things that were just said, want to go back to some of the discussion that we had earlier about terms, about terminology, and go back to some really basic terms, even some of the basic terms that we're using to title the course, and see if that can give us some traction and understanding what we're encountering. So first of all, this is a little bit about catching up community members with some of the discussion that we had in our closed session in class on Tuesday. I asked students to think about these words, arts and design. And I also want to think about this word time and media that is in the title of the work. And I shared with students a list of 4 key words that are going to be keywords that we're going to come back to throughout the entire course. Courses that we think, terms that we think we know, but that have a kind of multi-referentiality that we're going to be coming to terms with in different ways. So first of all, just to even think about the word arts, what do we even associate with that word arts? Catching up with community, and apologies to students if I'm not doing a full representation of everything that all of you said. When you all were brainstorming about what comes to mind when you think of this word arts or art, you were coming from different places. Some of you talked about that there's something about it as a mode of expression, but one that is a more abstract rather than literal mode of expression. Some of you talked about its storytelling function, and we saw that very much in work in the reactions to Bill Viola. People talked about the role of emotion and affective connection as a central principle about how art does its work. The history of aesthetics came up. People talked about the human need to create culture, and that there's something about this realm of the arts that seems incredibly important. And that was true to my heart and important for me generally, just to really foreground the role of the arts as a kind of human right. It's the right to imagine. The right to imagine is, to me, something that we want to endorse and make ubiquitous, and something that we want to remember even in these times where we're so removed from each other. Also, the idea that it's a multi-sensory form of communication, that it uses sonic material, imagistic material, we've already talked about it, in addition to textual material, the manipulation of space, that all of these different senses, sometimes touch, sometimes kinetic movement and embodiment, are all different senses activated in these forms. And others also reminded us that it also signals a variety of discrete different forms, i.e. forms that have congealed as a practice in a certain way, that have a certain history, that make us know them as similar and different from each other. So the arts are dance or theater or literature or fine art or music or film. And we talked about the variety of the art forms very briefly, and I want to remind everybody about some of the things that we said. We both talked about the role of painting, talked about the fact that painting isn't one thing, that painting has its movements and it has its different technical challenges. It also has a particular delivery system, and that this delivery system is the gallery delivery system might, and this white one with its white walls might look a little different from this type of gallery as a delivery system for painting. Also sculpture. We talked about its role in terms of its three-dimensionality. It's again associated with the fine arts or visual arts, but also to note that sculpture isn't one thing, and that part of what we're also going to be tracking is the way that sculpture starts to look a lot different, especially in the second half of the 20th century, challenge what we actually even think a sculpture is. The arts are theater, the arts are dance, the arts are film. Here it is. Here is a screen delivered in a space that is you're probably a little bit more used to, not the museum space, but the cinema space. The arts are music, again, delivered in a theater, but that theater might be a little different if it looks like a black box delivery system. So just to have in our minds all that variety, and also to remember that literature is an art form. This heretofore has been its traditional delivery system, the book that we hold in our hands, up until we started to read almost everything online. And that also it has varieties of different styles, whether it be novels or poetry, where we also think about the manipulation of text in a particular arrangement of words on a page as part of what's distinctive feature of the poetic medium. I had students just for a minute then, I asked them to think about what happens when they see an artwork like this. This is Lawrence Weiner's Inherent Innate Tension, where we see text on a gallery wall, or here again, we see it here. And again, I won't be able to encapsulate all of the incredible responses that students had when they saw this, but it was really interesting then to think about what happens when a medium associated with literature, the text, starts to inhabit the space associated with the visual arts. What happens when we see text that we associated with one medium appearing on another? Students had a number of reactions to this piece, also thinking about how the clustering of the letters obscured or abstracted. What they saw was that we had a sense of text and not simply as a vehicle for conveying a story, but text as itself graphic, that there's something about this piece that makes letters into an image. Also, that there was a sense that this type of piece was in dialogue with the mural or with street art or graffiti, with protest art, that there was potentially a political challenge that some felt. One lovely student called this piece mildly infuriating, which I really appreciated. I appreciated that comment so that we could all think about why might this piece feel somewhat antagonistic or infuriating or destabilizing in some way? What is it, because it's challenging media? Is it because it's compromising the gallery space? Is it because it's making a political statement that you don't quite understand? Okay, so these were some of the conversations we started to have about the arts, but then also what it means to start cross-pollinating across the arts. What happens when the art forms that we often associated with discrete practice start to become hybrid, start to become merged? All right, a little bit of some of the other keywords that we're going to be thinking about. The word design is often distinguished from the word arts, and it's sort of interesting to think about why. Design perhaps associated more with function. It might be associated with other practices, say, such as architecture, that may or may not consider themselves an artistic practice. Craft, tinkering, making, okay? So we'll think at different moments about the relationship between time-based media art, other arts, and design, things that travel under that term design, but also remember that artistic practices and artists, those who call themselves artists, are often always working with designers. Our time-based media artists are in an interdependent relationship with, say, exhibition designers, something we're going to get to think about more when Brett Snyder from UC Davis comes to talk to us about exhibition design. Also, other art forms, theater. Theater as an art form works in an interdependent relationship with designers of costume, lighting, and set design. All right, now we'll get to a couple more abstract thoughts here. What about this word time and the word time-based media? When you think about time, what types of associations, synonyms, or forms start to come to mind? Okay, here again, since I'm sharing my screen, I can't always see the chat. I'm going to be relying on Edgar and Casey to see if we can source from all of you just any associations that come to mind when you think of this word time.
We have a few coming in. Dorsa says dynamic. Frankly says Christopher Nolan. Angela says change, a measure of change.
Yeah.
And David says Andy Goldsworthy. Mohammed says real resource limitation. Michelle Williams says being present. And Eric Cortez says limits.
Oh, well, fabulous. It seems right there that everyone is coming up with associations that I would sort of put into different buckets. Associations that are perhaps a bit more existential. Perhaps, what is the limits of time? What does it mean for us to allow or to endure change? In addition to, some have ideas about particular artists that are perhaps associated with time, or with the manipulation of time, or the welcoming of time, or the excavation of time as a kind of material, with Andy Goldsworthy being one example. Thank you. Okay, if more start coming in, feel free to interrupt me, Edgar and Casey, about things that start to come to mind. I'm kind of a big one on etymology and dictionaries. And so I always think it's kind of fun to just look at definitions and see what starts to come forward here. And you'll see some resonance with some of the things that some people have already said. The indefinite progress of existence in the past, present, and future. So what it is to change, what dynamism might be. Here's something interesting in light of Barbara London and time, space, and her comments about time and space's physicality. Time is opposed to this definition calls it the non-spatial continuum, measured in terms of events that succeed each other. So it's this particular mode of durationality, and it's a particular way of marking and naming experience that is different from what might be called a spatial experience, i.e., a spatial experience that exists at one moment, that might have a lot of complexity and be in its environment, but is different from the progressive durationality of time. Here, very simple, a point of time as measured in hours and minutes. So we start to think about vehicles we have for managing time, for pretending we could measure time and count time. Here, time arranging when something should be done. I'll meet you at this time. This particular, and of course the particular collaborative decision to agree on the clock allows us to decide that we might meet at 12 o'clock or at 12:05 or at 12:10, or meet, as we call it, Berkeley time at 12:10. Measuring the time taken by a process or activity, all right? So those are just things to have in mind, I think, as we think more about what it might mean for time to be something that we don't take for granted as in an art form, but something that is manipulated, investigated, the object of our attention when we're experiencing an artwork. All right, I'm going to also now, here are a few different, I was just sort of thinking about vehicles we have for tracking time, for holding time, for archiving time, for remembering time. Time might be also associated with different kinds of memory devices, whether it's the formal history, the diary, or our own internal memory. What about that word media? Let me ask for a few associations of this word. What comes to mind when you think of this word? Any synonyms, any forms, any feelings?
Eric Cortez says social/interaction. Michelle Williams says film reels.
Yeah, so particular forms of media. Social flash interaction, I might have to ask Cortez Eric, what he means by that. Is it possible to hear Eric's voice?
Yeah, just to elaborate, I think mainly my thought process from saying that was kind of like communication, or like when I think of media, I think of like social media. So like, and even just like art through the media, you're communicating. So I think communication would have been a better one, but
okay,
yeah.
great. No, social flat, right. And the word communication tended to associate also with, say, communication or broadcast media, communication media. That now in the 21st century moment, we tend to talk a lot about social media, right? But the apparatus of large-scale communication. Other associations coming in?
We have a couple other comments that are similar to this idea of communication. Juliana says a platform to share thoughts or ideas. And Frankly says anywhere from Instagram to news outlets to YouTube. Mohammed says rhetoric.
Okay. As a rhetoric professor, I appreciate that one. All right. Great. So once again, let's go to a couple of definitions. And actually, the first definition that comes up in the OED does refer to this notion of mass communication, of the broad apparatus that of now global communication. We might also say social media that has, if not replaced, certainly supplemented the idea of core broadcasting. But the second definition comes up, at least in a few cases, is the plural of medium, which is, of course, also very helpful. But worth thinking that what happens when we actually look at this word medium next to it as well. So what is the word medium that might be a plural, that might be pluralized in this word media? So, and here we get, I think, also to some of the other associations that some of you started to derive. Medium as an agency or means of doing something. This is the medium by which we're communicating or meeting. I really like number 2. I think it's going to be useful for us. The intervening substance through which impressions and ideas are conveyed. So here we have really sort of thinking about if we go with a particular idea, which I don't always subscribe to, of we have certain kinds of content that we want to express. What is the intervening substance that we used to do that expression, okay? And really thinking about that intervening substance is part of what it means to think about deeply about a medium. So here also we have some more contemporary definitions: storage for digitized information, And let's not forget this one, a person claiming to be in contact with spirits of the dead as a medium, okay? We might even think, and we'll actually even see perhaps a few of our artists who actually even work in a semi-spiritual mode, who might not be too far off, at least in helping us think about the relevance of that association. Okay, so this word media and medium, I think it's ultimately going to be useful to think about these as a dialectic. What does it mean to think about media as a mass communication broadcasting system, now supplemented and expanded by the apparatus of digitization, the apparatus of the digital, the apparatus of social media, next to also some of these more finely grained ideas of the medium of a form, that intervening substance. As it turns out, this kind of dialectic of those two different associations also informed David Anton's disquisition on what he understood to be the emerging discursive landscape of video art. He put that discursive landscape into two categories, saying, one, a kind of enthusiastic, welcoming prose peppered with fragments of communication theory and Mcluhan-esque media talk. The other, a rather nervous attempt to locate the unique properties of the medium. Discourse 1 could be called cyberscat, and discourse 2, because it engages the issues that pass for formalism, could be called the formalist rap. So just briefly, what do we think he means by that? At the very least, first of all, he's invoking that sort of notion of the larger communication apparatus is part of what artists were coming to terms with when they began to work across these forms. And here, when he's referring to Mcluhan, he's referring to Marcel Mcluhan, one of a very, very foundational and influential mass communication theorist who recognized the emerging power of these mass communication forms for establishing what he, for instance, called a global village for connecting us across what were wires then, and of course it is wireless now. Next to discourse 2, the formalist rap. Perhaps it's a rap that we've already been engaging when we started to think about what the properties of painting were, or what the properties of dance were, or what the properties of sculpture were. That we're thinking then too about the medium as associated with an art form. And throughout the course and throughout all of these practices that we'll be analyzing, we're going to be tacking constantly, I think, amongst these two different associations. Okay? All right. So I'm going to now briefly connect these to some bigger aesthetic debates that it turns out that all of your thinking has already been engaging, whether it was self-conscious or not, and to see if we can deepen even further some of the insights you've already offered. So what I thought I'd do is connect some of these thoughts that you've had about time and media and the range of art forms to some other debated practices to think about time and space across media via a few past thinkers, at least Lessing and Benjamin being fairly well past. In order to understand and give some more traction to what the centrality was and what the contribution was of this later 20th century, now early 21st century practice. So Gotthold Lessing, he was a German philosopher who specialized in the emerging field of aesthetics. He worked in the 18th century, and he is someone who derived and became known for his disquisitions on the differences and allegiances between what were often called painting and poetry, and what he distinguished as those two fields, those two very big fields in the 18th century. As it turns out, when I was sharing this sculpture earlier, I was doing it somewhat, there was a reason for doing it. It's no coincidence. This is a sculpture of the Mcluhan, who is, this is a sculpture that's associated with the much longer, wider story recounted in the Aeneid by Virgil. where that includes a moment when Mcluhan, a priest a Trojan priest who is attacked at different times, and who is also, according to some stories of the telling of the Trojan War, one who anticipated the Trojan horse, anticipated the takeover, the sneaky takeover associated with that story. He's also known in various tellings as somebody who is ultimately killed when the gods send serpents to kill him, and also in some tellings kill his two sons. So in this sculpture, found excavated around, associated with around 1500, we have a moment, we could say it's a moment captured within this larger story. And when Lessing starts to think about relationships between painting, or also the visual arts, and poetry, he's particularly interested in what the difference and allegiances are between Virgil, the poet's telling of this story, versus what it is to apprehend an aspect of this story in marble, in sculptural marble. So he is in the position of trying to also establish himself as a critic, and he quotes one of his fellow critics at one point. This is a quotation that comes from a fellow critic, Winkelmann, at the time. He says, this, talking of this sculpture, this Greek spirit is portrayed in the countenance of Mcluhan. Even under the most violent suffering, the pain discovers itself in every muscle and sinew of his body, and the beholder, whilst looking at the agonized contraction of the stomach, without viewing the fact in the other parts, believes that he almost feels, the pain himself. This pain expresses itself without any violence, with both in the features and in the whole posture. He raises no terrible shriek, such as Virgil makes his Mcluhan utter, for the opening of the mouth does not admit it. The pain of the body and the grandeur of soul are, as it were, weighed out and distributed with equal strength and through the whole frame of the figure. So you can decide if that kind of description resonates for you. But it is interesting for me, just even thinking about it next to the Bill Viola raft, and that some of you were wondering what kind of scream, or if there was some type of vocalization that might happen. But here, once again, we have what is marble's capacity to communicate using its intervening substance, marble, and to express certain ideas. And this is that critic's way of talking about it. What Virgil's really interested in is using the difference between the sculpture and poetry in order to think really deeply about what he called in many ways spatial versus temporal forms of media. That's me using a contemporary language, and isolating differences in painting and poetry by suggesting that they are associated with a different kind of perceptual manipulation. Painting more associated with space rather than time. That poetry has the capacity to manage duration and to tell a certain kind of story, like the stories that many of you were already doing, as opposed to making use of the single moment and the largely still capacities of fine art. That painting is associated more with bodies, and that poetry is associated with actions. And here's things start to get even a little bit more. This is some of his vocabulary, that the painting and sculpture associated with the juxtaposition, the juxtaposed organization of elements, as opposed to poetry's consecutive organization of elements. And I just threw in here synchronic versus diachronic. Synchronic organization of expression versus a diachronic in-time organization of expression. We hear the word synchronic a lot these days when it comes to the COVID moment, as all of us are deciding whether to do synchronic learning or asynchronous learning. You can see I'm trying to maintain some notion of synchrony by asking you all to attend here. Side note on. So let's think a little bit about how Lessing phrases some of these distinctions. Here he is saying, if it is true that painting and poetry in their imitations make use of entirely different means or symbols, the first, namely of form and color in space, the second of articulated sounds in time, if these symbols indisputably require a suitable relation to the thing symbolized, then it is clear that symbols arranged in juxtaposition can only express subjects of which the wholes or parts exist in juxtaposition, while consecutive symbols can only express subjects of which the wholes or parts are themselves consecutive. Okay, that might seem a tad tautological, but at the very least, it is his notion at this time in the 18th century that certain types of subjects are really more appropriate for certain media, that some media do a better job of conveying certain kinds of subjects, and that we want to not criticize one medium for not doing something that the other medium can do better, but to isolate and focus on what each can do well, okay? He elaborates a little bit more in a way that actually seems incredibly resonant for some other points that you were making when he says, subjects whose wholes or parts exist in juxtaposition are called bodies. Consequently, bodies with their visible properties are the peculiar subjects of painting. Subjects whose wholes or parts are consecutive are called actions. Consequently, actions are the peculiar subjects of poetry. Okay, so why go back? A lot of course, what we're talking about throughout the course is going to be art forms that really emerged over the last 50 years. And we'll be thinking about them using very contemporary philosophical thinking, but at the same time, I think we don't want to lose the fact of how we might place some of these more contemporary forms in longer arcs of debate about how the arts function. And in particular, to think more about how the legacy of these notions of time versus space, the legacy of these notions of painting versus poetry, juxtapositive versus consecutive, start to become upended and redefined and merged and challenged, or sometimes restabilized in some of the work that we've already seen and that we're going to continue to see. So it might actually give us a way of thinking again about how we react to a Lawrence Weiner, about what it means when the poetic function, the function that's associated with the consecutive, experience of expression, is placed in the juxtapositive domain of the gallery. It might also give us a way of thinking, again, about Bill Viola's raft, about what happens when time and space, when the experience of durationality and the experience of image are joined in different ways, or what happens when the bodies associated with painting and the actions associated with poetry start to find themselves in some kind of dialogue. Okay, I've just been talking a lot there, but just to be sure that I'm still in sync with you and still there. Thoughts about that? Thoughts about taking this 18th century vocabulary to this ultra contemporary work? Do any of those thoughts reframe or any of the thoughts that you had earlier about the raft? And again, we can also navigate things in the chat, or if you're willing to say something aloud, we'd love to hear from you.
Michelle.
Oh, I was going to say we have one comment from Michelle. She says it'd be interesting to think of the raft occurring in reverse.
Let's everybody imagine that thought, especially when we get to the next person I want to talk about a bit. Yeah, a raft occurring in reverse, which is you could say a different management of time. So we could also say there that if there's the traditional definitions of time are about a particular commitment to moments happening in succession. What happens when we challenge normalized ideas of what succession might be by putting this in reverse? Thanks, Michelle. Any other thoughts?
And Muhammad says it would be like a memory, I think the in reverse.
A memory in reverse, yeah. So it would be a little bit like, since so many of you were noticing that these people did not notice each other, did not notice the danger, that what happens when you have that kind of traumatic moment? What do? You actually start backtracking, right? It's, you quote, replay things in your mind, right? And you could sort of say that that might be the impulse one might have when one has endured a disaster. Yeah, if only you could look at it in reverse. All right, well, let's have those thoughts in mind as we continue a little further with thinking about media and about the nature of media, by going a little farther forward by thinking about the thoughts of the great, also German philosopher, Walter Benjamin. Walter Benjamin, writing and working in the early 20th century, he is, as those who have done their reading know, he's a Marxist philosopher who thinks very deeply. It's hard to imagine somebody who thought more deeply about the role of the arts, about the political role of the arts during the early 20th century, but in particular about how changing technologies changed both the nature of the arts as well as changed our conceptions of self and society. So Walter Benjamin is quite concerned politically, as we will be throughout the course, on social and political themes. In his case, he was thinking deeply about the rising effects of capitalism, about xenophobia and religious intolerance across the globe, about world wars, and at the same time, he's thinking poetically and imaginatively about what he called, and it's one particular essay, the effects of mechanical reproduction are on the arts. So in this case, added to our discussion already of media, we might notice something that Walter Benjamin noticed that is now so normalized for us, it's hard for us to even to notice at all, which is the capacity to copy. This capacity that the photograph and other forms, the camera in general, brought, changed that fundamentally. As he says, and we can imagine, of course, the printing press also produced the capacity to copy. Here we're talking about the capacity to copy image. Here, when he says lithography enabled graphic art, of course, to illustrate everyday life, and it began to keep pace with printing. But only a few decades after its invention, lithography was surpassed by photography. For the first time in the process of pictorial reproduction, photography freed the hand of the most important functions, which henceforth devolved upon the eye, looking into the lens. Sorry, that should be lens. Since the eye perceives more swiftly than the hand can draw, the process of pictorial reproduction was accelerated so enormously that it could keep pace with speech. Again, we're so used to that, we don't even remember how wildly, what an incredible contribution and world-changing innovation that could be. Here also, what that does also to the arts. He very importantly starts to notice that whereas the arts normally were associated with something shared in a particular venue, in a particular community, with a particular delivery system that shared space in a particular way. He says that the uniqueness of the work of art is tied, the originality of the work of art, the authenticity of the work of art is embedded in that special consecrated space for its dissemination and sharing. The uniqueness of the work of art is inseparable, he said, from its being embedded in the fabric of tradition. This tradition, though, is thoroughly alive and extremely changeable. And any analysis of the art in the age of mechanical reproduction must do justice to these relationships, for they lead us to an all-important insight. For the first time in world history, mechanical reproduction emancipated the work of art from its parasitic dependence on ritual, the gathering together in synchronic space. To an ever greater degree, the work of art reproduced becomes the work of art designed for reproducibility. So this whole notion of art being something that is unique, one of a kind, then meets a world where it has the capacity to be constantly reproduced. And you can think about me even preparing this talk. I've put together images that depend upon reproducibility that Benjamin might not have been able to dream of, but when he was still lauding the effects of the camera. So this, I think, is incredibly important, because when we think about video art, it's both reliant upon the apparatus of mechanical reproduction, and at the same time, you could say it's vulnerable to the capacities of mechanical reproduction, or now digital reproduction. That the constant capacity to copy is part of something that produced the art form, and it's also something that you could say almost imperils the art form, at least imperils it from being able to present itself as unique, as original. This type of dynamic is going to be something we talk about throughout the semester. As video artists, in many ways, both were rejecting art world orientations for organizing the arts, from painting and sculpture. They wanted to be part of this ubiquity. And at the same time, there's a question about how do you live a life as an artist? How do you sell your work? How do you, if everybody can copy your work, how can you say you own it, okay? So those dynamics, economic dynamics and political dynamics, are part of what's here. Just a final thought from Benjamin that I want to get out. And I'm sharing a fairly big quote, partly to make sure that we're aware of how much he understood the new capacities of the camera to be something that changed our capacities for perception. The entire spectrum of the optical, and now also acoustical, you guys were talking about sonic and imagistic forms, perception, the film has brought about a similar deepening of apperception. It is only an averse of this fact that behavior items shown in a movie can be analyzed much more precisely and from more points of view than those presented on paintings or on the stage. So you even think about Mohammed right from the get-go, analyzing the actions of people in that Bill Viola. There's a kind of analysis that can come through the technology of film. As compared with painting, filmed behavior lends itself more readily to analysis because of its incomparably more precise statements of the situation. By close-ups of things around us, by focusing on hidden details of familiar objects, by exploring commonplace milieu under the ingenious guidance of the camera, the film, on the one hand, extends our comprehensions of the necessities which rule our lives. On the other hand, it manages to assure us of an immense and unexpected field of action. That should be field. A field of action that you might not have seen before. We calmly and adventurously go traveling. With the close-up, space expands. With slow motion, think about the raft, movement is extended. The enlargement of a snapshot does not simply render more precise what in any case was visible, though unclear, it reveals entirely new formations of the subject. So too, slow motion not only presents familiar qualities of movement, but reveals in them entirely unknown ones. So we think back to Lessing about certain subjects are appropriate to certain media. We're talking here about Walter Benjamin saying this new media is actually bringing forth new subjects. We have new things to think about that we didn't know we could think about, thanks to the advent of this technology. All right. Think again about Bill Viola. All right, in my last bits here, I wanted to simply invoke some of the key words that we're going to be thinking about throughout the series and throughout the course. There's so much about the history of video art, the history of time-based media art that is actually coexists with the history of performance that I realized we were going to be needing to think deeply about the role of performance. Sometimes performance artists who were making work in galleries with bodies, in ensembles, making use of both image and action, deployed new relatively inexpensive Portapak camera technology to document their work. So sometimes even the history of performance coincides with the history of video, because video starts to emerge as a place to even document some of the experiments done. And more, some of those documentations of performance work start to become artworks themselves. I have keywords around equality and equity here that we'll constantly turn to, because all throughout this series, we're going to really think deeply about how these forms, these intervening substances of time-based media art, are deployed to address larger social and political themes, whether they be issues of equity, whether they be issues of immigration, issues of food security, issues around climate change, issues around human rights, around race and gender relations. There is an interesting coincidence, as we'll talk about in remaining time briefly, of the innovations around these forms matching a political context and becoming forms that are felt to be readily deployable in order to address political themes. That actually leads us also into this last, perhaps slightly more abstract pairing of thinking in general about concept and the conceptual as a central part of an essential way of characterizing the milieu in which these artistic practices come into being. Students who did their reading have heard Barbara London, and they've also seen Lucy Lapard really talking about relationships between time-based media and the so-called turn to conceptual art practice. And that's a little bit that I'll just share briefly now. Students read Lucy Lapard's Escape Attempts, which is her recall of some of the work she was doing as a critic and curator at a time when conceptual art, or that term, again, a term that is differentially defined, but it starts to become a term that people use to characterize a whole range of hybrid practices across a range of forms. Lucy Lapard makes it very clear that she's talking about a time, as we've talked about, that starts to emerge in the 60s and 70s, when artists across a range of forms find themselves working in collaboration, creating mixed art experiments, or as we talked about with students on Tuesday, cross-pollination across art forms. And that it also coincided with 60s and 70s political activism, and that it was a time where artists were thinking about how to address issues around the Vietnam War, civil rights, feminist movements. And that definitely, that political milieu is informing conceptual art practice. So Lapard delineates two key pairings, two different associations that she associates with the conceptual. First of all, the notion that conceptual art starts to become less focused on material and virtuosity, the virtuosity of technical execution, and more on the idea, which is to say, not only the idea it provokes, but the ideas it starts to provoke, that it expresses, but the ideas it starts to provoke in its receivers. And also this notion of conceptual art as action, or sometimes she characterized both of these using this word dematerialization. But again, thinking from the perspective of the visual arts that might be associated with so-called static art forms, painting, sculpture, that the turn in conceptual art to time starts to become a central way of characterizing it, so that artists who were trained in forms that we might decide to call static start to deploy forms that we might call dynamic, to use one of the terms that one of you came up with quite early on. So that if you're used to working in marble, what happens when you start working with bodies? What happens when you start turning to something like dance? What happens when you start to think not only about the sculpture before you, but the plinth on which you put the sculpture, the room in which you apprehend the sculpture, What happens when you start to think about the people around who are encountering that part of the object world as part of the art themselves? Try to think of their actions, their behaviors as actually part of the art themselves. So the turn to things like, here we are, well, when we think about conceptual art as idea, one of the key figures who often comes up is Marcel Duchamp, who famously puts a, we'll just say, puts a latrine in a museum space, in a gallery space, in order to provoke, not only to challenge and to create mildly annoyed responses and receivers, but also to challenge and provoke people to think about how they know art is art, and to provoke that ideation, that moment of self-reflexivity where one stops to take for granted the idea that this particular object in front of you is art, but to sort of realize that it's a whole set of trappings around you, that it's the museum space, it's the way it's framed, that all actually help you know that something is art. So in this case, the idea that he's attempting to challenge is, again, the nature of art, but also to provoke the receiver to watch themselves receiving, you could say, watch themselves processing what they're encountering. A whole variety of other artists, many mentioned, including Lawrence Weiner, are considered conceptual artists who work on this, the notion of idea as the central sort of material, effect, and almost medium in which they're working. And that this so-called turn to action works right there with at the same time. Sometimes in things that call themselves performance art, sometimes in things that call themselves walking pieces, but in cases where, even in the case of, say, somebody like Muriel Latterman-Ukeles, who is initially trained as a sculptor, she begins, for political reasons, for feminist reasons, once she became a mother and started to be told that she couldn't be an artist and be a mother at the same time. If you want to know that story, I can tell it longer. Starts to do a series of washing pieces, she calls them, pieces where she starts to actually clean the museum space in order to foreground the necessity of laborers who keep the museum clean in order to apprehend the work, but also where she starts to work in the medium of action, where the medium of action starts to be, you could say, the condition of her sculpture. So we're in a situation where something that began static starts to become, quote, active, temporal, durational. Also, this is, of course, informing a category of practice that we might call performance art, as well as other practices. So we're going to be thinking about all of these and above more from Ukeles throughout the semester. And a reminder then too about the connection between these kinds of experiments and the political context in which they emerged, and now the political context in which contemporary artists we're here from are working as well. Okay, so yeah, here I'm just thinking about escape attempts, ways in which different art forms started to sort of leave, sometimes rejecting their parents, you could say, leaving traditional forms in order to create new ones. Since we have only a few more minutes, I wanted to just now, as anticipated, give you a little bit of a preview of the rest of our series. You can, of course, see all of the descriptions online about all of our speakers, but just to give you a tiny bit of color about why I thought that this lineup was important to have. We're really privileged right away to start with a now local artist who's also an international artist, Isaac Julian, as well as Mohal Modisekeng, who is in dialogue with Rhonda Pagnozzi, a curator at Oakland Museum of the Arts, who together are going to be thinking about their own time-based media practice, thinking deeply about issues of race and global diaspora, thinking about the related but different contexts of racial inequity from different positions on the globe. And also doing so with Rhonda, who happens to also be, and since I see a little spelling mistake, I'm going to correct it here, happens also to be a curator at Oakland Museum of the Arts, who's co-curating with Essence Hardin a show called Mothership, a show that focuses on Black Afrofuturism. As I said before, this course is always usually taking students to art exhibitions and to theaters, and we're going to be doing a lot of online engagement, but we're hoping that at the moment that any of the museums are able to open again, you're going to actually be able to see some of this work. Isaac's work is currently up at the McAvoy Arts Foundation for the Arts, and Mohal is going to also be in Rhonda's show. So we'll get to hear from them next week. We'll hear too from somebody else who's in the permanent collection at OMCA, Chris Johnson, somebody for whom who has a strong practice associated in politics, practice associated in community art and social practice, and whose political ambitions and community ambitions coincide with his time-based art practice. We're going to be hearing from two beloved international curators, Adrienne Edwards and Catherine Wood. Adrienne is at the Whitney Museum now, Catherine Wood at Tate Modern in London. She'll be zooming in from London. And the two of them are fonts of many important insight. One of the things that we're going to be really focusing there on is on the role of performance and its relationship to screen-based work. They really, I don't think that there's two curators who we could more powerful curators who work on that dialectic that we could have in dialogue. We're also incredibly excited and that we hope very soon, SF MoMA will be opening an exhibition on Nam June Paik, who is himself one of the early practitioners of time-based media art, especially as it engages with the television, the cathode ray as a particular medium. And one of the curators who's helping to bring that show, who's also chief curator of in media at SF MoMA, is going to be delivering the talk, Rudolph Freeling. And again, when SF MoMA opens again with that show, we hope students are going to be well primed to attend it. When people are encountering the history of time-based media art, we're going to be reading Barbara London's new book, and we are going to hear from Barbara London to talk about past archives and past platforms for amassing the work as well as the future. And we're going to also be thinking with somebody like Rebecca Clemen and George Fife, people who are, in say Rebecca Clemen's case, now the director of EAI, a foundational platform for archiving and organizing and disseminating work that was at the time and still continues to be increasingly hard to collect. So we're going to be thinking about the front end and back end of supporting this kind of work with these three. More key political themes about what it is to decolonize and engage in issues around decolonial struggle via different art forms are going to be a key element of both William Kentridge's appearance in our series, as well as chief film and video curator Chrissy Isles from the Whitney. We're going to also be working with outstanding artists who never stop innovating across these art forms. Candice Bright's also South African. We have 3 South Africans in the series who, Candice is really sort of known for thinking about the global machinery of celebrity, the global machinery of mass communication, and using that to inform the material of her work. Richard Moss is a very interesting artist who in many ways comes from a slightly different trajectory, a trajectory that was associated with documentary film. And he began to realize that the vocabulary of video art became a more apt and appropriate way for conveying and offering the type of substance he needed in order to convey what he most wants to convey about issues such as human rights, climate change across the globe. We'll also be thinking, getting to have an appearance from Shireen Nashat, who is actually a Berkeley alum, and one who really thinks about issues of transnational feminism in her work and is known both for her single channel filmmaking and award-winning single films, as well as her video installations. And Miriam Banani, who's we sometimes say an emerging artist who thinks about and deploys the trappings of Instagram, the trappings of social media as also material for creating her artwork. We'll start to conclude with a visit from Brett Snyder to help us think about what it is to put together an exhibition design on these forms, with Tanya Zimbardo to think about what the Bay Area has contributed to the history and future of time-based media art with key leaders from our own region. And we'll conclude to some degree where we started by thinking with artist Colleen Smith, whose show is also going to be reopening at SF MoMA, in dialogue with Essence Harding, the co-curator of Mothership at OMCA, fostering a cross-institutional dialogue between OMCA and SF MoMA via Colleen's incredible work on issues of race, diaspora, carnival, and community. So with that in mind, we have quite a full roster. We're now at the end of our time here at 1:31. I appreciate all of you humoring me by being such great students and great responders, even in this Zoom format, and offering me so much and even helping me learn along the way about so much about what we have ahead of us. So without further ado, I'm going to say thank you for joining us today. Please Zoom in every Thursday for this incredible lineup. I do hope and look forward to a time when we can recommit to the ritual of synchronic shared space and time. But for now, I look forward to connecting with you over and over throughout this screen, on the screen. Okay, thank you, everyone.